It's a talk essentially about design, something that we're hoping to think about a little bit more at m-iti. Obviously I come from a design background, and we're looking at hopefully bringing Mo over at some point to do a PhD. I'll talk more about that at some point later. Those of you who aren't from design backgrounds might have an idea about what design is, your own idea, probably informed by things like home makeover TV programs and so on. This is a different kind of design. It's a type of design that we were sort of looking at for the past 10 years at the Royal College of Art, where I was teaching and where Mo studied. And it's really a form of design that's more about asking questions about the way we want things to be, exploring, critiquing, and rethinking technologies, very much from a person perspective. So it's less about thinking about things like this and this kind of scale. There's a little bit of that involved, of course, but it's much more thinking about the big systems that we operate in and really questioning what we want for our lives and how those things could be made to happen. I think Mo's project is a great example of how design can think in much bigger scales across more complex time frames and so on, and address some of the complex issues that we're facing in the world today. That's enough from me, because I think the project explains what I've just said in a far better way than I'll ever do it. So over to Mo. He's going to talk for about 40 minutes or something, and then we'll have questions at the end. All right, thank you.
Okay, this project is a counterfactual history, and for those of you who don't know, I'm going to just very quickly explain what I mean by counterfactual history. Now, it's if we take probably the most common example of something like that in the genre, we could look at something like Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. I mean, that's become popularized recently with Amazon remaking or making the a film version of the book. Now, in this story, we take the starting point as the Second World War, where Germany and Japan win, as opposed to the European and American powers. And so things subtly start to change right from the start. America takes over, and within the context of this, you can see that the Statue of Liberty has changed from being the torch in the hand to the Hitler salute. The plane in the background of the novel, the high-speed supersonic plane Concorde, is showing insignias for the Luftwaffe. You can't see it very clearly, but that's the insignias on the plane. So the history is being overwritten by something else, things that happen for real. And so elements that happen for real are shown in the counterfactual history, but they're also overlaid with what possibly could have happened as well. So we've got the American continent taken over by the Japanese and the Germans, and they've divided up the country. So that's one example of counterfactual history. Now, I started looking at what we were doing in terms of energy, and one of the starting points for that was looking at the eras that we've had where we've had energy crises, and the most common, or the one that comes to mind most easily, is the 1970s, when we had the oil crises. But also during that period we had a referendum for Scottish independence, and for me that was a focal point, a pivotal point where we could start to change history. We could take that and see, okay, what else can we apply to this? So we had the 1979 vote that was happening for real. Now, there was a bunch of stuff that was happening that we'll explain a bit later about why we didn't actually have an independent Scotland in 1979. But that's the start point. So now I'm going to just talk a bit about the project itself, just go through the ideas that are kind of pivotal within the context of this project. So within the New Scottish Enlightenment, the name of this project, we have a timeline. Now the timeline kind of demarcates different periods where important things happen, like for instance Acts of Parliament, that are kind of essential for progress to happen along this timeline. They're kind of markers as well for progress. So, and they happen one after the other, and they make sense one after the other as well. So I'm just going to go through the film, and oh yes, this is the flag as well, because for Scotland to change as well, something subtly alters, and in this case, the flag for Scotland changes as well. So, 1979, an independent Scotland with Acts of Parliament that change the nature of Scotland. So a number of things happen. We've got, in 1980, I postulated that we'd have a sovereign wealth fund started, a bit like Norway started when they discovered oil. In Britain that didn't happen, but I'm postulating that it did. And that's quite crucial. We also have a bank established that disseminates the money, and a key feature there, which I'm just going to pause there for a second and go back, is the Intellectual Property Rights Act. Now, Scotland, oops, pause there.
Yeah, we start progress.
Certainly not you. Okay, so Intellectual Property Rights Act. Now, this is something that's fairly crucial to the whole New Scottish Enlightenment, because ideas are the things that really change the way that we think about the world. In this case, something that Scotland realises that's been stopping innovation is patenting the control of intellectual property. And so what they do is they realise that this has been halting progress, and what we need to do is disseminate information more widely. And in this case, they put an Act of Parliament in, and anything to do with energy technologies becomes essentially open source, or what we now call open source. So, to carry on, we have the Public Energy Act, Public Research Act, and that enables people to start investigating different means of making energy. So this is publicly funded by the government because they've created this sovereign wealth fund, and in contemporary terms, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is worth somewhere in the region of about $1 trillion. Britain, if it had created sovereign wealth fund, would have had more than that, but in Britain it was spent on tax breaks and making sure that corporations could work efficiently. So, but in this case, Scotland uses it for purposes to make the Scottish people independent themselves as well. So, going through it, we have other Acts of Parliament that take place. We've got, coming up, we've got the things like the Northern Hydro Alliance, which is kind of like an alliance of countries where most of their energy is generated by hydroelectric power. So we've got the start of this idea that we can connect different countries together, or bring them together, ideas that have similar kind of mindsets. And the Scandinavian countries have a left-leaning socialist perspective, and in this case Scotland does as well, because historically, within the latter half of the 20th century, Scotland has been largely socialist. I mean, this is evidence in actual political returns. Scotland usually brings in a Labour government, and England is usually quite conservative. So we've got other acts of Parliament that are happening as well, like community energy acts, which enable communities to come together to make energy. For instance, in 2000, they decide to get rid of nuclear and move on to something else. And I'll explain a bit more later on. In 2000, they also have a third millennium competition where they try to get rid of nuclear entirely, and nuclear fusion becomes something that they want to head towards. So, sorry. So, yeah. And we start to have a surplus of energy being generated, and that's getting traded as well. And you can see from the graph, we've got different types of energy that's being, energy sources that are being established. We've got hydro, we've got gas, oil, and coal still, but they're diminishing in popularity, they're diminishing in usefulness. And we've got other countries connecting to the power grid which is being established. Fusion happens in 2008 after massive investment from the Scottish Government, and the currencies, the nature of currency is altered as well. So within the timescale of this, a bunch of things start to happen which could conceivably happen. Now a lot of these things also have elements of truth in them as well, because there was mega engineering projects such as putting energy links, electricity links between Britain and Norway that have actually happened, that were happening at the same time period in 1994. We were having things like the Channel Tunnel opening after years of development. So those are similar things that were happening at the same in the time frame that we're talking about. Also in 1999 we had Napster being established. Now we've had peer-to-peer technologies for a while with IRC and Usenet, but in 1999 Napster was popularized, and within the context of this project, Napster is a key kind of technology. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So all these things come together to make a kind of plausible scenario for this counterfactual history. So let's just examine the first act, the Public Energy Act. This is the one that's that enables people to make their own energy. So a few things that the government would have done for real would have been have posters that would illustrate that this act was coming into place. They would have maybe leaflets coming through your door, and they would maybe even make a short film.
We realise that being an independent nation also means independence for its people. We want to use the money we've made from North Sea oil to give you the chance to make your own power. So today we're launching the Public Energy Act. We're offering grants and more help if you need it to turn your house into your own power station. In the next few days you'll get a leaflet through your door giving you all the facts. Where to get more information, how to apply for grants and more. And remember, wherever you are, if you want the help, we're here to give you the help.
So that would have been perhaps an example of what the government might have created in order to get people to understand that they can get money and what's out there. This would have been perhaps somebody who would have taken advantage of the money from the government. He's got his workshop, and there's I've added details to this as well, like things that would have been appropriate for the time. There's a red telephone sitting in the corner. That's you know, it would have been around at the time, that style of phone. There's a drill, and all these things are there really just to help convey that this can be an authentic image, and also the materials that the man would have been using, the methods of making the tank. For instance, the welding is a bit rough. Probably these days you'd probably just smooth it off. The glass you can't really see so easily, but that would have had sharp edges on it. It does actually have sharp edges on it, so when you actually see it for real, it looks like it's been really fairly roughly made. Because in the 80s you wouldn't really have had ground edge glass like you would now, and it's a safety concern that people have. So all these kind of details help to set the frame for the image and to convey some kind of reality to it. He would have been experimenting with this, so he might have been using materials that would help him to get to where he wants to go, maybe change the nature of the energy creation. maybe you would have ended up with something like this. And again, the details of this help to convey, I mean, this is within the context of design, help to convey that, that this might work. There's the coils in there kind of connote some kind of idea of energy, energy production, or some kind of idea that energy is being employed in the process somewhere. So moving on to the next one, the Community Energy Act. Now this was a departure from the community, the Energy Act before 1985, which was more about individuals. This is about communities, because communities also people can come together within communities to make energy happen, or create energy in other ways, rather than just doing it simply on your own. So within this context, again, the government is creating an advertising campaign. They've got posters, and the language has changed slightly, the visual language, and so we're really looking at kind of like a different time frame where this can happen, and things have evolved where communities can come together. And so it's trying to find communities where this could actually happen. And I realised that you had areas like Lochgelly, which was a former mining town. And this was a town that had been largely abandoned. Once the coal had kind of been mined out, people had kind of realised that, you know, perhaps we don't need to deal with this town, and so it was left behind, and it's kind of largely became a byword for gloom. The kind of things that happened there were like chip shops and pretty much fast food kind of shops, and undertakers, pretty much the only industries that exist in this town. And so within the context of this scenario, the townspeople decided to use the technology that they had, the skills that they had, and use the mines themselves. So what they did was, the technology was around for ground source heat pumps, and they used the actual infrastructure of the coal mines to then start generating heat energy. Heat energy then they could have used for other industries such as canning, food production, hospitality, because they're generating an abundance of hot water. So this is just an example of what a community managed to do within the context of this speculation. You could think of other situations, fleets of fishing vessels coming together. The fishing vessels could have acted as energy generating mechanisms. Other things, I mean, you could look at Madeira and look at what we can do in Madeira in a community context as well. And in 2000, as I mentioned earlier, we had the new Scottish government deciding to get rid of conventional nuclear energy, that's fission, where uranium is used, which is really a pretty inefficient way of generating energy. So again, they have a publicity campaign, they generate films, posters, and so on to highlight the fact that they want to move on. And if we take, for instance, something like the Longitude Prize, which Britain introduced in the 18th century, that was a prize where the government really needed to find out how to get across the oceans, and so they needed to establish what the lines of longitude were. And they offered a prize of about £20,000, which I think is worth about £2.5 million in today's money. 3,000 euros, I think. And that prize was established so that there was an incentive for people to find the lines of longitude. Similarly, they decided to have a prize, and again, it's happening in contemporary times with the X Prize and other similar prizes that are happening where we need to find other ways of for instance, getting into space that's not publicly funded. So this was an attempt to do that. And what this did was it then creates a global idea of energy production. So people from all around the world then come to Scotland, because Scotland is now again using its sovereign wealth fund to create an infrastructure where people can then start to collaborate and create fusion energy. And this is in the context of this. In 2008, somebody does it and creates this device where they're able to actually make fusion energy. Now, often within the context of science, sometimes you do get serendipitous results, and you can actually do have an unexpected result where something works. And this is perhaps what might have happened in this case. Now, alongside all these scenarios, or these acts of parliament, I created some stories as well, just to help furnish more kind of believability about what might happen within the design proposal, within the counterfactual. And stories about, fictions about where people actually living in that time and what might have happened to them. For instance, this was a short story about a girl who visited her grandmother in London, and in this context, Scotland has become very wealthy, and simply because of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because of the oil it now owns, and also in the 70s, before this counterfactual, the United Kingdom was in a very bad way financially. The North Sea oil that was established and which they drilled out enabled them to really become wealthy again. But all that shifted to Scotland. So England is now a poorer country in relation to Scotland, which is kind of like a reverse of what actually is happening right now. And so within the context of this fiction, there's quite a big difference between Scotland and England, again, but it's reversed. So that's the counterfactual. A little bit more about the whole idea of the Scottish Enlightenment. Well, and the New Scottish Enlightenment. Well, the New Scottish Enlightenment was about sharing ideas. It was about making things more egalitarian. And actually, that was the same that was happening, same as what was happening in the 18th century with the Scottish Enlightenment, with people like Adam Smith and David Hume. They were philosophers and economists who were interested in creating, well, trying to make things more egalitarian, thinking about how we live and maybe just shaping the direction that society needed to go in. And they were highly influential. And this is why I thought, well, within the context of this, we've also got an enlightenment happening. We've got a sharing of information. We've got people who are creating things and want to make things better for everybody. There's the creation of a different economic system as well, with the transfer of energy within peer-to-peer systems. So any extra energy that gets generated is given away. And so things are decentralized in that respect, and people have more ownership. And again, it's a type of enlightenment, and I figured, well, it makes sense that this is a new Scottish Enlightenment where we're revisiting what our aspirations were 200-300 years ago, and maybe making them real. But the context of all this is energy for me, because something that really demarcates us and other animals is our use of energy. And we've been using energy for about 2 million years back here in this timeline, where we've got us burning wood to keep ourselves warm, to cook our food, going into perhaps the deep future where we might be using something like dark energy or matter, antimatter kind of explosions to generate energy, or even creating Dyson spheres or Dyson rings to generate or to capture as much energy from the sun as we can. But in between 2 million years in the deep future, we've got other energy sources that we've used. For instance, when we've moved from the Stone Age into the Neolithic Revolution, which we call the Holocene, we started farming, we started settling, and we started using different types of energy, like, for instance, animal energy, because we needed to farm, we needed to transport goods, and we used animals and we used humans, and we started enslaving other humans. And gradually we built up different sources of energy, different ways that we could generate energy, like flywheels, for instance, where we started using about 4,500 years ago. We started using solar thermal energy in different ways. We started investigating different technologies like Baghdad battery, which is an early form of battery, which we think was made maybe in the early years of after Christ. And up until the Industrial Revolution, where we realized we needed something that was really energy dense. And what we've always done is use more and more energy dense sources. Like we've gone from wood to coal, and we've gone from coal into the 19th century. We've turned to petroleum, and in the 20th century we're using nuclear. So we've gone for more and more energy dense sources. And also the number of sources has proliferated as well. I tried to just off the top of my head work out the different energy sources that we've had from when we started using them to the deep future, and you know, it just seems to explode exponentially. At the moment we've got so many different areas of research into energy sources, both storage and generation. So that's a really major field at the moment. But within the context of the speculation, we also had events happening, like in the 1970s there were oil embargoes by some of the oil producing nations, and that led to massive tailbacks at the petrol stations where we were trying to get fuel. It caused such huge problems that people started trying to figure out other ways of making energy. And you know, in the 60s, within the counterculture movement, you had Stuart Brand, who created the Whole Earth Catalogue. And the Whole Earth Catalogue essentially can be described as, or has been described as, the hippie internet. It was a way of generating information and disseminating it in the most practical way at the time, which was making magazines and distributing those. Other people were doing something similar. Mother Earth News was creating books where you could where they did how-to guides on how to generate energy, make energy machines. So across the world, a lot of people were suddenly very interested in generating energy, because we realized that energy was such a fundamental part of our human DNA, our social DNA, and you know, we needed to find ways of doing it. In Germany, they were making their own magazines, their own fanzines to distribute, so people could just do it themselves. And in Germany, interestingly, it's been one of the few countries where it's really taken hold, and where people are taking really seriously the idea of energy generation that's independent from fossil fuels. So it's not directly tied to a resource, but it's actually technologies. Also, at the time, in the mid-70s, there was politically things were happening as well. England realised that with the North Sea oil that was going to become available, if Scotland became independent, then it would have access to all the North Sea oil, because essentially it would fall within its maritime limits. And so they commissioned a report by Professor Macron in 1974, and he suggested that if Scotland ever became independent, it would have access to such wealth it was almost unquantifiable, and it would become one of the richest countries in Europe, or probably the richest country in Europe. So the British government then decided, well, let's not make this public. So they sealed it up and hid it for about 30 odd years. It only came out in 2003. But in that time, the British government then used the oil revenues to basically get out of poverty. So so that was also influential in enabling the no vote to happen at the time, so that Scotland didn't become independent. There are other things that were going on as well. In order to make sure that Scotland wasn't independent, they instituted a factor within the vote that 40% of people, 40% of the entire voting public had to vote yes. So that was people on the electoral register who might not have even have been alive but hadn't been taken off. So at least 40% of people had to vote yes. In actual fact, 52% of people voted yes within the context of this, but because it was still less than the actual 40%, Scotland didn't become independent. Other technologies were happening as well within this time period, because research was being funded by governments. And this is an example of a device by Stephen Salter, who was an engineer working at Edinburgh University in the 70s and early 80s. And he was investigating wave power. And within the context of the counterfactual, perhaps this might be something that somebody took as a starting point for their own machine. Like, for instance, the man working in his workshop, he might have thought, okay, well, this is interesting, and perhaps I can use this technology to take that as a starting point. Because, of course, this, within the context of the scenario, had all become publicly available. So, this, in reality, in the 1980s, when Thatcher and Reagan got into power in America and Britain, what happened was that a large amount of the funding for alternative energy sources got axed and went into conventional energy processes. So Stephen Salter, his design, which at the time seemed like the best design to harvest energy from the waves, that got axed. And then he tried to fund it other ways, but it took him much, much longer. Just looking at the graphical language, I want to try and really use the graphical language that was happening at the time. This is roughly about the same time period as the Public Energy Act 1985. I wanted to use the same style so that it would convey the idea that it was an authentic piece of government propaganda, if you like, or public of information dissemination. This, for instance, was a film.
There are nearly 5 million council tenants living in Wales, many with families like yours. They go on paying rent every week. But if you've been a council tenant for 2 years or more, you now have the legal right to buy your house or flat. Discounts range from 32% to 60%. And remember, buying on a mortgage can often cost little more than paying rent. In the next few days, you'll get a leaflet through your door with all the facts. And when you've read the facts, you can decide whether to turn your home into your house.
I wanted to really use the same clear ideas that was used in this film from an actual film about how to buy your own house from the council. Because at the time, Britain was going through this housing revolution where the housing market was deregulated and people could buy their own council houses. And they conveyed the information very simply. It was a short film and it just gave you the basic facts. And in the film that I made, the short film, I wanted the same kind of thing. Convey all the facts very simply. And so that you just watch that and you know exactly what that's about, what this public act is going to be about. Insignias of state were useful as well because they conveyed that something might be changing, which is why I changed the Scottish flag to the flag that I did. Also, we had in the 80s we had a campaign about AIDS, HIV, and this is the thinking behind the leaflet that came through the door. We have the objects themselves. Now, one of the things about the objects is that I really wanted them to convey some idea of realness, reality. This is Panamarenko's Superpeptobismo, and this is a sculpture that Panamarenko, an artist who deals a lot with with I guess, machines that could possibly work. He does a lot of aviation kind of machines that are a bit unreal, but give the idea that something can happen. This is a backpack, so it's got straps. You can strap it on, and the rotors look like it could work. There's a motor there. The whole thing looks like it could work. And I wanted to kind of convey the same kind of idea with what I was doing. And so I needed to give the objects a designed purpose. I needed them to look as if they could do something, even though, you know, with the fusion reactor, obviously it's not a real fusion reactor, but I wanted to kind of give the idea that it could just become a fusion reactor if you looked at it closely. So I set about trying to work out the different elements, like how would I make the coils. A standard coil is quite boring, and so I wanted the coils to have a purpose. I wanted them to look as if they would do something in addition to producing energy. So I went about and had created a few different iterations and came up with what I figured would be the final design, and then created armatures for wrapping, and tried to find out ways that I could get this done. It was quite a complex process because this is quite an unusual thing for somebody who makes coils to do. So it was a bit involved, and it took me a while to find somebody who could do it, and eventually they did, and they came up with the coils, and this is the final coils, a close-up. And you can see that they don't look like traditional coils, but within the context of this, within the sphere, you can see that they have a purpose, or the idea is that they have a purpose. Also, I wanted to iterate the different final visual aesthetic of the project, so I modelled it in 3D and iterated it out until I came up with something that I felt would give me the idea that this is an object that could possibly work. And so from the iterations, I came up with the final model, which where this detail comes from. Other key technologies, 1999 we had Napster. And as I said, peer-to-peer technologies had been happening previously, but with things like Usenet, IRC, Internet Relay Chat, and it was only really Napster that popularized it. And within the context of the scenario, peer-to-peer energy seemed to be an intelligent way of distributing energy from different producers. So you had independent producers who had been making their own energy machines, but if they had a surplus, an energy within the context of a peer-to-peer energy grid, they could put the surplus onto the grid. And it could be distributed in a way that perhaps we can't distribute energy without. So peer-to-peer seemed to be the most intelligent technology to do that. So it was a matter of finding out what technologies were available or what were emerging, and seeing what place they had within the scenario as well. More recently, we've had other things like carbon wires. This is something that's been developed both at Cambridge University. Chris Cazoyle at Cambridge University has developed a way of manufacturing carbon wires. Also at Rice University, there's a unit there that are doing something very similar. And essentially what that means is that we can create wires from the air, because what they do is they take the methane and the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn them into cables, into wires. So what that means is we don't have to go around prospecting for copper anymore, and we can just, we don't have to spoil the earth to digging up copper, which is vastly polluting, and we can just make them like this. Of course, this technology is fairly elementary at the moment, but it means that we can introduce something like this, and then maybe create our own peer-to-peer grids using carbon wires. They've experimented with it as well. It does actually work, and it does transmit electricity, and they've managed to make components, electromagnetic components, where also it works. And just finally, just about peer-to-peer. At the moment, people are working with peer-to-peer systems. Piclo is a company that's just started up in the UK. It's experimenting with peer-to-peer. Now, it's not peer-to-peer as we might think of torrents as being peer-to-peer, but it is peer-to-peer in as much as you can go to a supplier of energy, somebody within the context of the New Scottish Enlightenment who might be making energy, they can then transmit it to somebody else. But in reality, this is what they're trialling at the moment. There's another company in the Netherlands, Van der Bron, who are also trialling something similar. So these things are starting to become reality now, but it's a combination of different processes that are happening. Within the context of the New Scottish Enlightenment, it happens in another way, but you can see that things are actually happening now. Okay, I think that pretty much covers the Scottish Enlightenment, the New Scottish Enlightenment, and kind of the reality and the counterfactual within the design proposal and what's actually happening in the real world. So, if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
You can start you always the first.
Yeah. You read it first.
That's last time. I was looking at paper already. So if I understand correctly, the idea is that you not use the power grid, but you would transmit your power generated home to your neighbors through the cable made of copper.
Well, with Piclo, they actually do use the power grid. But what I'm suggesting is, in a peer-to-peer system where it's established by the government, like within the context of the New Scottish Enlightenment, they might use a technology like carbon wires and realise it's a clean technology, relatively clean technology, and they can then connect people up to each other. And so you can then create another grid. In the context of Piclo and Van der Bron, who are experimenting with peer-to-peer, they're using existing grid. Now, it's quite a complex thing to try and transmit energy along the national grid, but this is how they're doing it at the moment. It's not peer-to-peer as we might think of, for instance, torrents being peer-to-peer, where you're perhaps getting bits of information from lots of different computers. That's how I envisage peer-to-peer energy transmission to be, but then you need to have a somewhat different network. You need to have a network that's essentially much more interconnected than just the central outward radial network that we have at the moment with our national grids. So they're based on national grids, which is why they're just, it's more of a, I think they describe it as an Airbnb kind of model where there's a consumer-producer relationship that's quite linear rather than being more scattered or distributed. So it's a little bit different. Yeah.
This is more energy transfer like Tesla electricity.
Yeah. Well, it's. I think Tesla was more about the central energy generation because he was talking about AC electricity, and so he's talking about larger power plants.
Which Tesla are you talking about? The original one or the new company?
No, the original.
The original.
Just to be sure.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's. I mean, that's what we've adopted really, the idea of central power generation, and so it's. I mean, I think Nikola Tesla's stuff was never fully developed, so nobody really knows how that would have gone because he was looking at, I think I'm right in thinking, ultra high frequency energy, which you could then essentially transmit wirelessly, I think. Within the context of this, that's a technology maybe that is a little bit too far. I know I've talked about fusion energy, but that's something that we're on track to get because there's a lot of research that's been happening since the 50s about fusion energy. But yeah, Nikola Tesla's ideas perhaps might be outside of the context of the design speculation, because I wanted to try and get as many elements that had certainly a core of reality in them. And because it's largely unexperimented, we don't know how wireless electricity can function.
I've got a mean one.
Go on.
It's not so mean. What do you see as the purpose of the objects that you made in the ideal scenario? I mean, I know within this context it was an MA, quite a short period of time that you developed them, but let's remove that time frame. If you were to build these things again with maybe a slightly grander budget, what purpose do they serve? Because clearly they're not exactly functional in a normal sense. So what kind of role do they serve in the world?
It's an illustrative role, really, because it's about provoking a conversation, having some kind of if you're having a reaction to it, it's about thinking what context do these objects, what context do they lie in? It's about having a discussion about the idea, like for instance within New Scottish Enlightenment, is can this actually happen? I've tried to make it as believable as I can, using as many kind of core ideas that are around as possible, as much as possible. If it were to happen again, it's about trying to make a project that is possibly doable. I mean, we're speculating about something that that might happen, but why don't we kind of take that discussion a bit further and maybe open it up, maybe make it a political discussion. It's political discussions are not something that normally within the remit of design, but I'd kind of like to make that the remit of design, because we can't just really be making, chairs. I mean, as designers, I think it's our responsibility to take design a bit further, because it's almost a moral obligation to think about design in that context of making it wider, making it more interactive, making it more plural. That's kind of what I think. That's why I'm interested in this kind of idea of design. Counterfactuals kind of fit within that.
Are there, examples of practitioners in this sort of speculative design practice that you think have had an impact, let's say outside of the design world, because we're talking about politics now, in energy production, of the kind of scale that you're talking about?
Scale I'm talking about. Speculative design is a fairly it's a fairly new subject. It's design interactions as a department. It's only about 10 years old, and it hasn't really stepped out of that quite as much as I feel that it needs to. And I think it's about breaking new ground in terms of applying the ideas of speculative design, critical design, design thinking, and making it more political, making it actually accessible to politicians. Because whilst it's gaining currency, I think something like this helps it to gain more credibility, more credence, because people can actually have a discussion about politics, because you're already talking about politics. So I think within the context of this, it's fairly early to really be giving concrete examples of people that actually make change with speculative design. It's something that I think we can do, I think.
I was wondering, so when you worked on this project, did you have any specific thought on sustainability, so that actually this change of energy and peer-to-peer would have an impact on energy globally that would make it more sustainable or green? Or did you not think about actually if everyone's having their own sort of nuclear plant, it's to make it worse? Did you have an idea around improving things globally?
I think one of the things that was also happening in the 70s was this idea that we have the world and we live on the world, and the whole Gaia hypothesis, Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, that Earth is an organism, that was kind of really current in the 70s. And it was about looking at what was happening in terms of thinking then, and it really hasn't changed that much to now. I mean, it got sidestepped to some extent by new oil being discovered, oil becoming cheaper in the 80s, and we kind of forgot about alternative energies. But you know, if we'd continued making alternative energies, continued researching them from the 70s, then we would have had a very different paradigm to what we have now, where we're kind of desperately grappling for alternative energy technologies. And so for me, it was a fairly political project to begin with, because I wanted to illustrate how we could get to this point in 2021, where we're exchanging energy, but that's becoming a currency. I mean, how do we get to that point? Well, for me, it was very logical that we continue doing what we were doing, and we don't then have the problems that we've got now. And it was to a large extent about sustainability, about political change, and how to kind of create that political change, and what seeds do you need to sow to make that happen. So, and engaging kind of like arguments and ideas that you wouldn't normally have within a discussion about design. So for me, it's all about politics, and kind of looking at our environment and having responsibility, moral obligation.
So this could almost be a roadmap for the G21.
I'd very much like to think so.
If they actually went through every single one of your steps to get to this.
I'd love to think so. Yeah. I mean, of course, it can be developed further, but yeah.
I really enjoyed your presentation,
Thank
and
you.
I like how much attention you pay to political economy. And just following on from how much in your responses you referred to politics, I'm wondering, well, I'd like to learn more about the role of nationalist politics in this particular project, and whether you're perhaps seeing it more as a narrative device to open up an alternative future, or if there's something more that you see. So I'm trained as an Africanist, and in a way I see this potentially as a kind of post-colonial utopia of all the problems and possibilities that might pile up.
I mean, the context of the Scottish independence movement was that it essentially wanted to secede from England, wanted to become its own country, obviously. But that was a narrative that was happening in the 70s. Since then, there's been a narrative within the Scottish National Party of having more progressive politics, making things more egalitarian. And I wanted to use that narrative within the context of this project, because politics has grown up since or nationalist politics has grown up, has matured since the 1970s, when it was simply about becoming free from England. And it was kind of just a reaction to being essentially colonised by England. And the politics that have evolved have become, I guess, more developed, more nuanced. There's an understanding that now, especially since the last economic kind of crash in 2008, that these crashes have happened because of economic reasons, and how do we make the economic situations better? And the Scottish National Party, in some cases, in some way, want to make this better because they're quite left-leaning. They want to kind of create this environment, and that's also why I allied them to the Nordic Council, because they also have socialist kind of perspectives, and so does Scotland. And so it made sense to me that it's a Northern European country. It should become part of the same kind of community thinking that happens up there. Whereas England is slightly different. It's much more capitalist. It's commercially driven, and so there's a kind of a different mindset. And I mean, as I said earlier, I mentioned very briefly that Scotland also, when it's been voting socialist or voting kind of left wing, largely for most of the last half century, and that's enabled the left wing Labour Party in Britain to get into power, and so the future for Britain in terms of national politics looks quite bleak, since the Scottish National Party, which is a party just for Scotland, has become has taken over all the Labour votes. So it's now Britain is going to be quite possibly continue to be conservative. So I think in terms of national politics, it tries to become more egalitarian, certainly in Scotland, and that's the direction I wanted to go in with the project. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Good.
No more? Okay.
Thanks, Blaine.